Ken Peters? The name might not ring a bell for everyone, but within the tight-knit community of marine mammal trainers, it held weight. By 2006, the year the impossible happened, Peters was no rookie. We're talking about a guy who had dedicated almost 2 decades of his life to these animals, spending countless hours in and around the water with some of the most powerful creatures on the planet. This wasn't a job for him. It was a vocation, a calling, something etched into his very being. He wasn't the flamboyant type, the showman grabbing for the spotlight. Instead, Peters was known for his calm demeanor, his meticulous approach, and his almost uncanny ability to read the subtle cues of these complex animals. He was the kind of guy you'd want in your corner if things went south, because he could keep a cool head in a pressure cooker. His peers respected him, his superiors trusted him, and the orcas. Well, the orcas seemed to respond to him. Think about it. Stepping into the water with a multi-ton apex predator requires an almost unbelievable amount of trust. It's a delicate dance of communication, a constant assessment of mood and intention. You're relying not just on your own training, but on the animal's willingness to cooperate, to acknowledge you, to essentially agree to play by the rules. And Ken Peters had mastered that dance. He'd spent years honing his craft, studying every nuance of orca behavior, learning to anticipate their movements, their needs, their desires. His connection with orcas wasn't forged in the roar of the stadium, but in the quiet moments behind the scenes. He knew the routines, the feeding schedules, the intricate social dynamics of the pod. He understood their individual personalities, their quirks, their preferences. He'd seen them at their most playful and their most vulnerable. And through that shared experience, he'd built something real, something tangible at SeaWorld's San Diego. Peters developed a particularly strong bond with one orca, Kasatka. Now Kasatka was a formidable animal, even by orca standards. Captured off the coast of Iceland back in 1978, she'd spent almost her entire life in captivity. She was intelligent, powerful, and possessed a commanding presence that demanded respect. She was a matriarch, a whale who knew her own mind and wasn't afraid to assert her dominance. But for Ken Peters, Kasatka was more than just a performer, more than just an animal to be trained. She was a partner, a collaborator, a being he'd spent countless hours connecting with. They had a history, a shared repertoire of behaviors that they executed with precision and grace. They'd performed together for years, developing a rhythm, an understanding that seemed to transcend words in the rehearsal pools. Away from the prying eyes of the audience, their bond was even more evident. Peters would swim alongside Kasatka, hand-feeding her fish, engaging in playful interactions that showcased the depth of their connection. He'd press his face against hers in carefully choreographed displays of affection. There was laughter, there was trust, and there was an undeniable sense of mutual respect. Think about the sheer audacity of that. A human willingly placing himself in close proximity to a creature capable of inflicting unimaginable harm, and doing so with complete faith. It speaks volumes about Peters' skill, his experience, and his understanding of these animals. For years, everything seemed harmonious, the illusion of a perfect partnership, a testament to the power of human-animal connection. No hint of aggression, no sign of the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. It was a relationship built on trust, reinforced by countless successful performances, and seemingly impervious to disruption. The audience saw the smiles and the splashing. They were ignorant to the complexities of captivity, the limited space these massive creatures occupied. the constant strain of unnatural demands placed upon them. But beneath the surface, unseen and unacknowledged, something was shifting, a subtle but insidious change in the dynamic between man and whale, something that no amount of training, no amount of experience could have fully prepared Ken Peters for. The ingredients for a nightmare were slowly mixing. The forced proximity of Orca to human, the stress of performance, the suppression of natural instincts, the powerful maternal drive of Kasatka, the potential for a deadly reaction. And that's the terrifying thing about working with wild animals, especially those as intelligent and powerful as orcas. You can spend years building trust, establishing a connection, but ultimately, you can never truly know what's going on inside their minds. You can never fully anticipate their actions. You are, in essence, placing your life in their hands. Every single time you enter the water, on November 29th, 2006, inside the crowded Shamu Stadium, that trust would be tested in the most brutal and unforgiving way imaginable. The years of shared experience, the countless hours of training, the carefully cultivated bond between Ken Peters and Kasatka, it would all be brought to the brink. The illusion of harmony would be shattered, revealing the raw and unpredictable power that lurked beneath the surface. And in that moment of crisis, Ken Peters would face the ultimate test of his skills, his courage, and his will to survive. The scene inside Shamu Stadium had transformed from a spectacle of marine wonder to a raw, visceral display of the power and unpredictability of the ocean's apex predator. Ken Peters, a man who dedicated years to understanding and trusting these magnificent creatures, was now fighting for his life in a desperate battle against the very animal he knew so well. The initial screams from the audience quickly morphed into a terrified silence, punctuated only by gasps and the occasional, heart-wrenching sob. Children, wide-eyed with horror, clung to their parents. The popcorn buckets they held moments before now forgotten and discarded. The festive atmosphere, the bright colors, the upbeat music, all vestiges of the show evaporated, replaced by an oppressive sense of dread. Below the surface, Ken Peters was locked in a life-or-death struggle. Kasatka's grip on his foot was relentless, a constant crushing pressure that threatened to sever bone and tear flesh. Each time she plunged him into the depths, the cold, chlorinated water stung his eyes and filled his lungs, the burning sensation, a stark reminder of the dwindling oxygen supply. He fought to remain calm, his mind racing to recall every training scenario, every emergency protocol drilled into him over years of working with orcas. But this was no training exercise. This was something primal, something raw and untamed. He knew that any sign of panic, any frantic movement, could trigger an even more violent reaction from Kasatka. The water around him swirled with bubbles and blood. The once clear visibility reduced to a murky grey. He could feel the immense power of Kasatka's body as she propelled him through the water, the force of her movements leaving him disoriented and helpless. He was no longer a trainer, a partner, or even a familiar presence. He was prey above the surface. The scene was one of controlled chaos. Trainers scrambled frantically, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and determination. They grabbed emergency equipment, nets, poles, even fire hoses, anything they could use to distract Kasatka and break her hold on Kendot. The rhythmic slapping of the water with poles echoed through the stadium, a desperate attempt to mimic the sounds of other orcas and draw Kasatka's attention. Whistles pierced the air, shrill and urgent, carrying commands that were now useless. Ken was trapped in a silent world only he and Kasatka occupied. The trainers on the pool deck knew they couldn't enter the water. Protocol forbade it. They could only stand helplessly by, their expertise rendered useless in the face of Kasatka's raw power. They were forced to watch as their colleague, their friend, was repeatedly dragged beneath the surface, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. Each time Ken resurfaced, gasping for air, the collective gasp from the audience was almost deafening. The brief respite, the desperate intake of oxygen, was a momentary reprieve before the next plunge into the abyss. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the stadium became almost unbearable. The initial shock gave way to a chilling realization. This was not going to end easily. Ken Peters was in a fight for his life, and his chances of survival seemed to be diminishing with each passing second. Underwater, Ken's mind turned to his family, the thought of never seeing them again adding a sharp edge to his determination. He had to fight, not just for himself, but for them. He focused on his training, relying on the techniques he had learned to survive. He kept his body as relaxed as possible, conserving oxygen and avoiding any sudden movements that might provoke Kasatka. He tried to maintain eye contact with her, hoping to re-establish some kind of connection, some flicker of recognition. But her eyes were cold, distant, devoid of any familiar warmth. At one point, as Kasatka held him pinned near the bottom of the pool, Ken felt a searing pain in his foot. He knew she had tightened her grip, the pressure intensifying to an almost unbearable level. He fought to suppress a scream, knowing that any sign of weakness would only embolden her. Back in the stands, the spectacle had become almost too much to bear. Some audience members turned away, unable to witness the unfolding horror. Others stood transfixed, their faces pale and drawn, as if they too were struggling to breathe. Paramedics stood ready, their faces grim, prepared for the worst. A rescue boat hovered nearby, its engine idling, ready to spring into action if the opportunity presented itself. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Time seemed to distort, each second feeling like an hour, each breath a precious gift. The weight of the situation pressed down on everyone, a heavy blanket of fear and uncertainty. Then finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, something changed. Kasatka surfaced one last time, but this time, she didn't immediately plunge back down. She paused, her massive body hovering in the water, her grip on Ken's foot loosening slightly. Ken sensed the shift in her behavior, a subtle change that offered a glimmer of hope. He remained motionless, unsure if it was a trap, but ready to seize any opportunity to escape. Seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ken began to swim, his strokes weak and uneven, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. He focused on the edge of the pool, the platform where safety awaited. The distance seeming impossibly far. Trainers reached down, their hands outstretched, urging him on. He knew he had to reach them, had to pull himself to safety before Kasatka changed her mind. With a final surge of adrenaline, Ken reached the platform, his fingers clawing for purchase on the slick surface. The trainers grabbed his arms and hauled him out of the water, pulling him to safety just as Kasatka surged forward again, momentarily breaking her trance as Ken collapsed onto the concrete, his body battered and bloodied. A collective sigh of relief swept through the stadium. He was alive. He had survived the 10 minutes of terror, but the events of that day would forever be etched in his memory. A stark reminder of the unpredictable power of nature and the inherent risks of working with captive orcas. The illusion of harmony had been shattered, replaced by a chilling reality. The world had witnessed the nightmare you were never supposed to see. The $75,000 fine levied against SeaWorld might seem like a pittance, a mere slap on the wrist for a corporation generating millions. But understand this, it wasn't just about the money. It was about precedent. It was about the government, through OSHA, formally acknowledging that keeping orcas in captivity and allowing trainers to perform in close proximity with them was an inherently dangerous proposition. The ruling wasn't just a financial penalty. It was a dam breaking. It cracked the carefully constructed facade of safety and control that SeaWorld had cultivated for decades. The investigation, the court case, the released video footage, all of it forced a level of transparency that the company had desperately tried to avoid before the attack on Ken Peters. Before OSHA got involved, the narrative was carefully managed. Orcas were portrayed as playful, intelligent, and ultimately predictable. But the courtroom evidence, the testimonies from former trainers, the slow-motion replay of Kasatka's relentless assault, all of it shattered that image. It exposed the raw power, the inherent wildness, that no amount of training could truly erase. SeaWorld, in their defense, argued that they had always prioritized safety, that they had extensive protocols in place, and that the attack was an isolated incident, an unfortunate deviation from the norm. But OSHA didn't buy it. They highlighted Kasatka's documented history of aggression, the numerous near misses that never made headlines, the internal reports that hinted at the growing psychological toll of captivity, the ruling and the upholding of that ruling upon appeal meant that SeaWorld could no longer operate under the same conditions. Waterwork, the signature element of their orca shows, was effectively outlawed. Trainers could no longer swim alongside the whales, could no longer perform those close contact interactions that had been the cornerstone of the park's appeal. Physical barriers became mandatory, distancing trainers from the very animals they were supposed to be connecting with. This had a ripple effect throughout the entire marine park industry. Other facilities that featured orcas were forced to reevaluate their own safety protocols, to invest in new infrastructure, and to grapple with the ethical implications of keeping these apex predators confined. The attacks did more than just alter performance regulations, though. They fundamentally changed the perception of SeaWorld. Attendance dropped. Protests intensified. The company faced mounting pressure from animal rights groups, from concerned citizens, and even from its own investors. People started questioning the inherent cruelty of keeping orcas in tanks, of forcing them to perform tricks for entertainment. The release of the documentary, Blackfish, in 2013, only amplified this shift in public opinion. The film used the attack on Ken Peters and the subsequent death of Dawn Brunshaw at SeaWorld Orlando as pivotal examples of the dangers of orca captivity. It interviewed former trainers who spoke candidly about the stress and trauma they experienced, about the growing understanding that these animals were suffering in confinement. Blackfish was a cultural phenomenon. It sparked a national debate about the ethics of marine parks and the treatment of orcas. SeaWorld's stock price plummeted. Corporate sponsorships dried up. The company was forced to launch a massive PR campaign to try to repair its damaged reputation, and ultimately they had to concede. In 2016, SeaWorld announced that they would end their captive orca breeding program and phase out their theatrical shows. The era of Shamu, the era of trainers swimming alongside killer whales, was officially coming to an end. It was a victory. For animal rights activists, a vindication for former trainers who had spoken out, and a testament to the power of public opinion. But what about Ken Peters himself? What became of the man who had survived nearly 10 minutes of terror beneath the surface? He did return to SeaWorld, but his role was significantly altered. He no longer participated in water work, and his interactions with the orcas were strictly limited. Understandably, the attack left a lasting impact. The physical wounds healed, but the emotional scars ran deep. He had dedicated years of his life to working with these animals, to building trust and rapport. To have that trust shattered so violently, to have his life threatened by the very creature he had come to care for, was a profoundly traumatic experience. While Ken Peters has kept a relatively low profile in the years following the attack, his story serves as a constant reminder of the risks inherent in keeping orcas in captivity. He became an unwilling symbol of the debate, a living embodiment of the complex relationship between humans and these intelligent, powerful creatures. His experience, coupled with the death of Dawn Brunshaw, forced a reckoning within the marine park industry. It led to stricter regulations, to a greater emphasis on trainer safety, and ultimately to a fundamental shift in the way orcas are viewed and treated. While SeaWorld has tried to distance itself from its past, the attack on Ken Peters remains a pivotal moment in its history. It's a reminder that even the most carefully orchestrated performances can be disrupted by the unpredictable nature of wild animals, and that the pursuit of entertainment should never come at the expense of safety and ethical treatment. The $75,000 fine was just the beginning. The real cost was far greater: a loss of public trust, a tarnished reputation, and a permanent shift in the way we view orcas in captivity. It forced us to ask ourselves difficult questions about the ethics of entertainment, the responsibility we have to protect these magnificent creatures, and the true cost of keeping wild animals confined for our own amusement. The end of water work at SeaWorld was more than just a policy change. It was a cultural shift, a sign that attitudes were changing, and that the era of orca captivity was finally drawing to a close.